The ownership of water has become a totemic issue in British politics in recent years. And Andy Burnham, who argues for more public control of the sector, has a big decision to make. The UK's biggest water company is set to go bust by October, and the government has to work out what to do about it. One option is to nationalise Thames Water. And in June, Burnham told The Guardian that this was his favourite option. Public ownership is absolutely an option, I would say, for Thames Water. That is what should be done. Seems pretty clear, but in the short term at least, it could also be pretty costly. Thames Water is in £20 billion worth of debt, and if the government takes it over, there'll be legal challenges from creditors about whether the Treasury should pay that back. Another option is to put Thames Water into a special administration regime. That is a form of temporary public control, which the Times reported on the weekend as being Burnham's most preferred option in the here and now. This would involve a government-appointed administrator running the company for a short period of time until a buyer could be found. The state would have to pay the running costs, and the £16 billion in debt would be frozen. Then, after a period of time, the company would be sold off again. Whatever the price it sells for, that would repay the money spent by the government during its temporary administration, and the rest would be distributed to creditors. But this means the current creditors losing control and then ultimately losing a lot of their money. The creditors, mainly American investment companies, don't want that to happen, and instead have proposed their own plan. They want to take over the company themselves, write down 30% of its debt, then add some of their own capital, but on the proviso that Ofwat, the water regulator, relaxes their targets so they can avoid any fines. And if that doesn't sound complicated enough, over the weekend they added a new proviso to try and soften up Andy Burnham to help them take the company over. They've said that if Burnham approves their plan, they will give the UK government a golden share in Thames Water. All sounds very Trumpian. This could give the government a veto over key decisions, including whether the company could be sold. And today, they've suggested a further compromise. According to The Telegraph, they say if they're allowed to take over the company, they will give the London mayor a position on a supervisory board. So a golden share with the government and the London mayor being consulted. Consultation often is, as I like to say on the show, a fugazi. It's often a kind of fake political trade-off. You're not really giving anything to anybody. You can consult, which basically means you can talk, we'll pretend to listen, and then we'll do what we want to do anyway. What should Burnham do? This is a really complicated problem.
I mean, it's incredibly complicated because the whole structure here is incredibly complicated. And it took me a long time to get my head around it, sort of researching it today. But I think I've understood it. And what he should do is put it into special administration and then work out over the next 2 years how he can not sell it to another sort of incompetent private equity conglomerate. And ideally find some kind of publicly controlled non-profit sort of municipal corporation who they can give it to. And I think what took me a while to sort of get my head around is the issue when it comes to, actually, so let's start with the fact that it's privatized in the first place. So it's privatized in the first place, and that's a big mistake, right? This is a natural monopoly. There are good things about private ownership of the means of production, which tends to involve competition, innovation. Now, you can't have competition or innovation when it comes to water because it's pipes to people's homes, and you can't. I shop with Thames Water and I can't shop with anyone else. So it was ridiculous to sell it off in the first place. They partly did it for ideological purposes. I mean, they mainly did it for ideological purposes, but also because Britain was becoming subject to an EU directive in the late 80s, early 90s, which was going to require a lot of investment, and the Tories wanted to keep that off the balance books. Or keep that off the balances. So they wanted private companies to come in and provide that investment so that the Treasury didn't have to say, we're going into more debt. Have you heard that before? That's what the PFIs are about under New Labour as well. So an accounting trick, which works in the short term, but works in the short term just in terms of making your accounts look a little bit better to the financial markets, but screws you in the long term. We're in that long-term period where we're screwed. It hasn't worked. This company has taken out $7 billion in dividends. That was more the previous owners, Macquarie, and they're now £16 billion in debt. So we're in a stupid situation which we should never have been in. What do you do at this point in time if you're Andy Burnham? Now, the obvious thing to say is just nationalize it. Privatization hasn't worked, so let's just turn around and say, you've failed, we're nationalizing you, we're taking over the company. Now, the people who own Thames Water at this point in time wouldn't actually mind that. So the people who own it, they're a bunch of pension funds. They don't want it. They bought it for sort of 5 billion or whatever, and they've written that off. They've said, this is useless. We don't want anything to do with it. So we could buy it from them for very little right now. The issue is the creditors. So it is in debt by 16 billion pounds. And if we were to nationalize it tomorrow, then we would take on those debts. So the government would have 16 billion pounds extra on its debt pile. So that's why the more likely option is this special administrative regime. And what the special administrative regime means is that the government appoints an administrator. They sort of just run the companies, because obviously the water still needs to come out of our taps. Pipes still need to get fixed. So you have a sort of bureaucrat in charge of managing it. And the debts are all frozen. So they're not wiped off, but they're frozen. And then after about 2 years, the government sells it off again. And then the price that it is purchased for first goes off to pay the costs to the government, and then goes down and pays the other creditors according to seniority. So ultimately, sort of the most sort of obvious thing that you do if you don't want any transformation of power in the system is you just do that. You sell it for 10 billion to some other private company in 2 years' time, and the creditors sort of take about a 30% hit. Some of them get some money, some of them don't. But we'd just sort of be going over this again. What you actually want to do, I think, is put it into this special administrative regime. That means we don't take on the debts, and then find a way that we can sell it to someone who isn't a private corporation that's going to rinse it and milk it for all that it's worth. So ideally, you'd set up some kind of London water corporation and you'd sell it to them. Because interestingly, in the special administrative regime, you don't have to sell it to the highest bidder. So, you could sell it for potentially a low cost. Again, the problem here is that if you screw over, because obviously what I would want to do is screw over the creditors. They lent to this stupid ass company, screw them over, just sort of say, you're going to have to take this massive haircut. The reason that's going to be difficult for the government is because if they do that, then no one will lend to any of the other utilities. So then we'd have to nationalize everything, which is possible and probably a good idea, but that's an awful lot of political capital and government attention. And if he's desperate to bring sort of growth and benefits to cost of living in the next 2 to 3 years, then nationalizing the whole water industry and keeping the financial markets on side is going to be a lot to ask.
I mean, 16 billion would build lots of council homes.
Exactly.
You could remake the UK housing market across whole regions with 16 billion. It's a lot of money, shouldn't be sniffed at. You said the water shouldn't be privatized. I want to go over some numbers very quickly. Privatization is what, 1992?
Yep.
I think since then, these companies, which in 1992 didn't have a single penny of debt on their balance sheets, now they're cumulatively, I think, looking at about 80 to 90 billion pounds worth of debt. Similar figures in terms of dividends that are pulled out. So they're in the red by tens of billions. Tens of billions have been pulled up in terms of dividends. These were companies, like I say, without a single scintilla of debt. No investment's been made into them. We'll talk about that more in a moment. The paradigmatic example of all this, like you said, was Macquarie with Thames Water. Macquarie, who are they? These are asset managers. It's an Australian company. What do asset managers do with things like water? They generally have what are called closed funds. So they'll say, we have a closed fund with regards to this industry, housing or water or whatever. Pile in, give us your money, often pension funds. We can give you great returns. It's a 10-year fund, so it has to close after 10 years, hence it's called a closed fund, not an open fund. 10 billion, and we're going to spend it on this or that asset. In the case of Thames Water, they buy low, they underinvest, they cut costs, they raise prices, and they sell it for more, okay? So you buy cheap, you sell high. Sounds great, of course, unless you're the customers, your bills go up for an inferior service, and of course, the organization, in this case, Thames Water, is lumbered with a ton of debt. The workers are treated like crap. You also see it with the Royal Mail, similar thing, right? Prices go up, underinvest, workers are squeezed, customers are screwed. Same theme repeatedly. The question is, what do you do about it? What's the best thing to do here? I should say 16 billion sounds like a lot, and it is, of course, but Thames Water is huge. Thames Water has about 16 million customers. I think 1 in 4 people in England and Wales use Thames Water. So there is a conversation there about, well, if the government has to bail out the company with billions, it's probably worth it. I think 16 billion is probably too much. And I think what you're saying about the special investment company or special investment
A special administration regime.
Special. God, I love it. It sounds so dengist.
Yeah.
I love it.
And then a bunch of people in the comments are saying, Michael's saying, do all of this and then just sell it back to the private sector. I'm saying, do all of this and then find some kind of organization to sell it to that is municipally controlled.
Yeah. That's owned by
the City of London or something.
Well, not the City of London, Michael.
Not the City of London, sorry. The
Mayor of London's office.
Yeah.
Michael is trying to save you, folks, £16 billion and you're hating on him. 16 billion can do a lot. No, seriously. 16 billion can build a lot of social housing. We could scrap tuition fees and student loans for nurses for a long time with 16 billion. The ownership structure of Thames Water might be bloody confusing, but this is something their customers will understand. Thames Water has just announced a hosepipe ban for 10 million people, so about 2/3 of their customers. The water company said its region had seen 40% of the average rainfall that it might expect, more days at or above 34 degrees C this year than ever previously recorded. Maybe climate change is actually a thing. That's something they aren't lying about, and which they obviously can't control. Something we might blame them for, though, is this. Not a single new reservoir has been built since 1992, the same year water was privatised. And the body that represents the water industry has warned there's another problem coming down the line. Water UK, which represents the industry, says the government's AI strategy has failed to take into account the stress that data centres pose to the water supply. The answer there might seem fairly simple. Just build fewer data centres until we have sufficient water supply. This is more worrying, however. Water UK has also said that a shortage of water will get in the way of the government's plans to build 1 million new homes. Michael, what do we do about water? I mean, you've already outlined your very contentious plan for the future of Thames Water, but climate change means more problems. We've underinvested for a really long time. Bills are going to have to go up regardless, right? I think this is something that people don't understand. If we brought the entirety of the water industry into public ownership, we start to build the infrastructure like more reservoirs that we have to build, bills are going to go up a lot. And the government's going to be on the hook for that. By the way, I think they should go up because we need to rebuild really critical infrastructure for the public good. A lot of swing voters aren't going to like it, though. They think, well, if you bring that into public ownership, it means that we're not going to have hikes to our bills. Well, you will. It's just the hikes won't be going to shareholders. It'll be going to actually building stuff.
Well, the argument for privatization was always to say, if it is in state control, then the government is always going to be inclined to sort of win votes to keep prices low and to not invest because that's always the next government's problem. And also, if you've got competition between investing in water and investing in healthcare, they're always going to choose healthcare. So the idea was you take it off sort of direct provision from the government, and that will encourage lots of investment because this private company doesn't have to compete with the NHS, and they're going to be willing to raise prices because they're not looking for votes. Obviously, they're going to be regulated, so they're not going to be able to raise prices as high as they want. But they're going to be able to make those long-term decisions. That was the theory. Now, in practice, we haven't had a reservoir built since 1992. So clearly something didn't work. But there does have to be an argument made to say, we need to make serious long-term investments into the economy in all sorts of ways. Reservoirs. I mean, there is a super sewer being built under London. That seems to be like the one good thing that's happening in the water industry at the moment. But obviously, they did that with a bunch of debt. Now they're going bust. So, yes, we need much more water. I mean, I know lots of people's response would just be saying, well, it's all the data centers. Now, I think one data center takes up about as much water as a golf course. So it's not nothing, but it's also not everything. Most water is actually used by agriculture. You don't want to build the data center near a very heavily populated area or somewhere that's already got water strain, but you probably can build them somewhere. But the issue is infrastructure and investing in infrastructure. And the big issue is, I suppose, again, partly, obviously, Thatcher wasn't reluctant to privatize anything. So it wasn't that they were forced into it. But Labour and this particular government, it is this argument that they don't want anything on the Treasury's books. And then in the long term, it just screws you, right? It was the same with PFI. We don't want the new hospitals on the books, so we'll get a private company to build it and then we'll rent it back from the private company. Can we please think in a 30 to 40 year timeline?
Yeah.
And then maybe we'd have some reservoirs and we'd be able to build the homes.
Great societies are built by people who plant trees and their ancestors, or the descendants rather, can sit in the shade. Lovely, lovely phrase.
Beautiful.
This is neoliberalism, right? Neoliberalism, and you get people like John Rentoul at the Independent saying, "What is neoliberalism?" There are literally tens of thousands of Google Scholar, cited articles that you can find about neoliberalism. David Harvey, one of the most cited social scientists in the world today, literally wrote a book about it, but I'm sure that probably doesn't count for John Rentoul. What is neoliberalism? It's a war against the future, right? That's what it does. It systematically discounts the future for the here and now. And a classic example of it is with something like privatization of water, privatization of rail, or even right to buy. I did a downstream recently on right to buy with Peter Apps, housing journalist. And the more you learn about right to buy, the more you understand. It was in terms of net utility maximization in a certain moment in the mid-1980s, you could actually make an argument for it, right? But the point is today, many of the places where you saw the social housing being sold, many of those places now, more than 50% of that social housing is in the private rental sector. And it's had hugely damaging effects. So what you've done is basically declare war on the future. What you've done is sell off all of this housing stock. And by the way, the money wasn't even going back to local authorities. They've lost a revenue stream. They were making money from social rents. Not much. That was a revenue stream for them. They lose the revenue stream. The proceeds of the sales go to the Treasury to massage deficits. And of course, Thatcherites on the right love to talk about fiscal prudence. Thatcher ran deficits every year, even whilst selling stuff, while privatizing stuff, even while screwing local authorities. She was doing all of these accounting tricks and they were still running deficits. So it was never a tenable political economy or way to run the country. Much of the right still can't accept that. And core to it, like I say, is this: declaring war on the future. And basically, the crap and the garbage from the 80s and the 90s is having to be resolved in the 2020s and really the 2030s. I saw Tom Harwood say, Andy Burnham has basically concluded we've failed for 40 years. I wasn't born in a country that was failing. Actually, until I was a teenager, it felt like Britain was quite a successful country. By the way, that's quite a fair assessment. I would respond, I don't know what you think about this, Michael, that the post-2008 malaise we're stuck in, the dysfunctions of much of our welfare system, the spiraling housing benefit bill, for instance, these were a necessary and inevitable consequence of the kinds of decisions that Tom cheers on.
Thatcherism was a sugar high, right? A sugar high for the
sugar
economy.
High.
Because you sell off everything, that does create some income in the short term, but you've sold off the family silver. And also you deregulate finance, which means that house prices go up, which, for one generation makes everyone really rich because their house is expensive, but then the next generation can't afford any houses. So then you feel very poor. So it's a sugar rush. I think this also relates to, and especially with water, like how irrational and crazy it all seems, to an argument I come back to a lot. Your conversation with Dan Wang was all about this. So he's got this book where he talks about China being a nation of engineers and America being a nation of lawyers. Now, Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson in their book, Abundance, I really like both of them. I think they're both really smart, open-minded, clever people. But they mainly put down America being a nation of lawyers, almost down to the left and liberals, because they say environmental protection became a big priority, which was good, but it's gone too far. And ultimately, we need to let both the state and businesses build more stuff with less restrictions. I think a big part of that is also neoliberalism, because it used to be that the state would do it. So if we just had a department that was expert in building sewers and building reservoirs, and it was filled with engineers, and then a few people who had financial expertise, and then, it would need some external accountability, I'm sure, but then they could do this quite simple thing, which is build reservoirs, build sewers, and decide on what price you're going to charge people. Right? Maybe you make it arm's length so that it's not competing with the NHS. There are a bunch of things you can do, which, by the way, is what happens in most of the world. No one else privatizes water. Maybe it should be municipal. Lots of arguments to be made there. But that would be a system which is led by engineers. Instead, neoliberalism, what it gives you is a system which is necessarily led by lawyers and financial engineers, because all the state does, the state's power is to sign legal contracts with different people to try not get screwed over. So it's you sign this legal contract to say you will provide water at this price. Oh, and then, by the way, if you go bust, then we'll have this special administrative regime. And it's all about liability. If this goes wrong, who's liable? Whereas in China or in France, right, you've got an agency which says, okay, we have a problem. We want to get water to everyone's houses. How do we solve it? Let's do that. I think that's the better way of running this kind of thing.
And do you have a message for Tom Harwood, Michael?
Well, Tom Harwood said the reason Thames Water went bust is because Ofgem set their prices. He said, well, if they were able to set their own prices, then maybe they wouldn't have gone bust. So I replied to him on there, like, do you seriously think that water companies, like the original natural monopoly, should be able to set whatever price they wanted when the consumers have no choice but to get that water, right? It's crazy.
Yeah. I mean, Robert Nozick, who's like the libertarian philosopher par excellence, makes these arguments, right? And the best example is there's the Wilt Chamberlain example in Nozick, but there's also the one about being in the desert and compulsion, right? So people like, don't mean to be wrong about Tom, most people that are sort of apologists for market capitalism, which is liberals, they say that wage labor, me selling my labor for a wage is a free act, right? I choose to do it, you choose to do it, it's a consensual act. And then, of course, the argument is made, well, if you were dying of thirst in the desert and somebody comes along with a bottle of water and they say you can drink it, but you have to pay £10,000 to drink it, wire that to my account with Monzo right now, or whatever, or give me that ring or watch that's worth all that money. Is that a consensual, fair exchange? And I thought that was just a metaphor, but it turns out that's how Tom wants to run water policy in this country. Please, I'm dying. I need water. I'm parched. Thames Water, sorry. A glass of water is going to cost you 20 quid. It's the fair market price if we want to improve our infrastructure. And by the way, they don't even know the condition of between 20 and 30% of their estate. This is the crazy thing with Thames Water. Imagine you have a house and you say to the builder, I want my house completely redone. I want the plaster done. I want the electrics, the water. I want the roof sorted. Okay, so how many rooms have you got? Don't know. Don't know. Well, you don't know. Well, I've only been to about 2/3 of the house. Maybe there's another floor. I don't know. How many bathrooms you got? Don't know. Maybe there's an ensuite at the top. This is crazy. How can you even put a price on the amount of investment that's needed in Thames Water when they don't know about a third of the estate's condition? Remarkable. That's got nothing to do with zero. It's because these people are crooks. This is institutionalized corruption, especially under Macquarie and then afterwards. Am I allowed to say that? Maybe.
Maybe not.
Maybe I mean, we'll cut it afterwards.
The other thing is they literally own the pipes in perpetuity. So, like, obviously, privatizing the railways didn't work very well. And actually, we did sell off the rail track. It ended up coming back into public ownership. By the way, then that was because they went bust, but the government did take on the debt for that. So there's sort of some precedent there. But as it works now, is we tender out sort of the function of running the railways for sort of 7 years at a time. But the fundamental infrastructure is still owned by us, which gives us the power, right? We can say, okay, well, and this is what the Labour government are doing now. When your contract comes to an end, we're going to take it in-house. The reason water is complicated and there's all these legal wranglings is because they legally own the pipes. And so the debtors, obviously, when a corporation normally goes into administration, all of its assets get sold off and get given to the creditors. But in this situation, what do? Do you say, okay, well, we'll sell off all the pipes and give that to the creditors and then we won't have water? You can't sell off infrastructure that fundamental to private corporations because the profit motive, like the disciplining effect of the market, cannot work with the pipes that we all use to stay alive.
David Harvey, the world's most famous living Marxist, I think it's fair to say, he has a great perspective on this. He says, look, I'm not really a big fan of the market system. But if you want to sell things in a market and make money and be competing against people, he said, why would you want to be in natural monopolies? They're so unsexy. They're so boring. The margins are so low. There aren't big margins in water. There aren't. There aren't big margins in rail. There aren't. Go into T-shirts, go into cars, go into laptops, go into making mugs. You can, of course, get your Novara Media mug here, no Future Utopia now at the Novara Media shop. Go into, by the way, these aren't particularly expensive. They're very good. The T-shirts as well, very good. Very good supply chains. Organised, unionised labour, cotton.
The margins, they're tiny.
The margins are tiny. We're terrible capitalists, but you get my point, right? So look, if you want to be in love with capitalism and make a ton of money, knock yourself out, stay away from water and trains and public utilities. Nobody is benefiting from this more broadly as a society. Of course, some people are the shareholders. Crazy, so self-destructive. Political cannibalism. This is society eating itself. Let's quickly go to one of your comments before we go to our final story. I can feel my mouth getting very dry. I'll have a glass of water in a second. We have £10 from @BazCams451. Confiscation won't cost anything. I don't think that's technically true. As Michael said, there are costs. If we were to confiscate without giving them some kind of return, then of course that diminishes the incentives for other people to extend lines of credit to other water companies or other utilities. There would be some costs. Okay, so what are the costs we're willing to swallow as the British public? And by the way, most people want to see water in public ownership.